they're seeing this is real life. And I think in the film, you know, we get some elements of that, but it's not until the end where you're just like, really? Like, that's how we're gonna end? And in the end of the film, I'm thinking, you know, Spike Lee's Bamboozled in 2000, if you've seen that film, and really having us think through blackface, minstrelsy, whiteface, and what it means to have the violence of performance put in our face. And that was a film that I ended just like, I don't even have any words. And I think there's some elements here in the book, but also in the film, where it ends and you're just like, okay, now what are we supposed to do with that? It leaves you like that, but that's part of the point too, where you know, Everett writing Thelonious Monk, Ellison, people are supposed to read and be like, this is not believable. But instead, it's like, oh, this is the real. This is, you know, yeah. And as we're thinking through the canon of African American literature, we have, you know, several texts that we can think about. We can think about Black No More in 1931. We can think about, I mentioned Native Son and Invisible Man, and it's really this idea of like, what is the real? And then you get Sapphire writing Push, which became the film Precious, which when Precious came out in 2009, it got a bunch of accolades. That story, those stories, you know, directly parallel when we think about Centara Golden, you know, the character, Weeze lives in the ghetto. That was a direct criticism of Sapphire's book, Push, which, you know, Clarice Precious Jones is, you know, struggling with literacy. She has 2 children by her father, and there's this criticism of like, is this real life? And for some, yes, but why do we look at that as one single story? And I think that's another piece that comes through in the film and the book too, right? We can have a bunch of stories. And Monk's story in the book and the film is a story unto itself, right? So why do we need the fictional version, back to the title American Fiction, to make it believable?
Yeah, and I just love the nuance of the way it engages with the criticism of those stories, that it's not, those stories shouldn't exist, those stories don't represent anybody, but there has to be more. I can't just rely on that. So like, I teach African American Lit, I'm teaching it this semester, and I've designed my class to not include any of the canonical texts, anything dealing with slavery, anything dealing with racial trauma, to do more sci-fi, more fantasy. But I also make sure that I tell my students that, like, I'm not saying those other books are bad. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with stories that are actually about slavery or that directly related to race or that get into struggle and suffering that are related to racism. It's just that you probably aren't not gonna read a lot of African American lit in your life because it's gen ed and they're not big readers. So I want you to read other stuff. I want you to see that there are more stories than just the stories that you expect. But in Wednesday's class, we do a little ground laying thing, and I talk to them about what their expectations of African American lit are. Like, what do you expect this to be about? What themes do you expect it to address? And there's a lot of stuff about strength and perseverance and overcoming, and just this expectation of struggle as something specific to African American life and African American art, that I just think that's troubling as a narrative, that there's not, you know, love and joy and family and community and all this other stuff, humor, creativity, imagination. It's reality that they expect.
But the question about what is reality is there in all of those texts too. The moment in the film where the character is sitting outside of the studio and, you know, dressed as if he's in a movie about enslavement, you know, we're thinking about these ideas of like, those are true stories too. I started out teaching early African American literature and still write a lot about 18th and 19th century African American literature, and part of my point was like, these are stories of freedom, these are stories of joy, these are stories of life too, so we can have those. It's just that it's not one story told in one way. We're looking for the humanity in all of them. One of my students asked me one time earlier in my career, like, how do you go to sleep at night? And I was like, I put my head on the pillow, I pull my, covers out. But it's like, you're engaging these stories so much, and I'm like, but we have to think about the complexity of humanity in every single story. And so, we acknowledge that. I think I wouldn't sleep well if I wasn't able to acknowledge it, or if I wasn't able to look at the humanity in every narrative. What got me is that, the sister dies early in the film. In the book, spoiler alert if you haven't read it, she's shot by an anti-abortion protester in the book. And so even, shifting it to a heart attack in the film is a different way of having us think about, Black women and death. And so,
why do you think they changed that?
Oh, so many reasons. For the same reason, well, they kept the Roe versus Wade joke, right? But I think there were certain moments and topics that they're like, ooh, yeah, we can't do that. Like, oh, we'll keep the story mostly, but even as I talk about the book within the book and the narrative of the women in that story, gets cut off. It gets reduced to this conflict of man against man. But I think we still don't know what to do with Black women's stories.
Why did they do the movie now?
Why did they do the movie now? Cord Jefferson, who's the filmmaker, writes about how he thought he was gonna get a TV series and it got rejected, and he was really sad about that, and so he's looking for stories to tell, and he came across Erasure, and it kind of represented the story about, what do I have to do to sell a film? And that was directly related to, Percival Everett's narrative about what do I have to do to sell a book or to be awarded for a book. And so I think the why now is because we're still thinking about these questions of what does success look like, but what does success look like for Black art? So, even having just watched the Golden Globe Awards, and you're thinking about, okay, well, is Color Purple gonna win something? We think about what happened with Woman King, thinking back to, it took Monsters Ball for, Halle Berry, and so what roles, right, actually get recognized? And I think, that story still resonates. What do you have to do, for the art to be recognized? And that's the main question.
The time jump between 2001 when the book came out and now 2024 when the movie comes out is interestingly reflected, I think, in the movie because there are things that have changed and there are things that absolutely have not.
Right.
So when the book came out, he was very much responding to a particular text that had come out a few years earlier, but he was also responding to Native Son, which had come out many, many decades earlier. So he was responding to not just like a momentary trend in publishing, but a long-term preference for gritty realism that portrayed Black life in a particular way. And I don't think that's the trend in publishing anymore. Interestingly, I actually think if there is a trend, it's reflected in the kind of family story that the movie kind of depicts with more warmth than I think the book does. There are a couple of other trends I think going on as well, but and those are much wider open in terms of what can be told within those trends than the one that he's responding to. But there's also, we're gonna time this for Juneteenth and people
It's Martin Luther King weekend.
Yeah. People talking about prison abolition and the way that the conversation about diversity is happening. The language is 2024 in the movie, but the conversation is a very similar conversation to what was happening when he was writing the book.
And we still have the Oprah effect.
Mm-hmm.
Even when we're thinking about The Color Purple now, we have the character, when you come on the show, you get that particular type of recognition. And, we still have the book club, what gets selected, what gets shown. watching that moment in the film when, he's shadowed, and I'm like, no, they're gonna have, Coraline watching on TV and be like, I know who that is, but then that doesn't happen. And I'm like, come on now, somebody's watching this, somebody's gonna acknowledge. But I mean, you talk about trends, I think we still do have this idea of what one book gets minted success and by whom. And if, somebody sanctions it inside the community, then, it becomes popular outside of. But, it still doesn't answer the question of what is good Black art. And we can have a lot of different versions. I mean, it doesn't have to be, again, going back to the one story.
Which I'm proud to say my students articulate that idea themselves without me having to tell them.
Good job.
Yes.
Yeah. Do we want to take any more thoughts? Does anyone have something pressing? We have more things to discuss, but yeah, what have you thought about even as you continue the process?
So I was thinking about the movie, and when you guys mentioned Thelonious' perspective, and do we accept that as, reality, right? He's more of a protagonist. And as I was watching and kind of processing, I think I could kind of resonate with his frustration, because as, a community, Black people, that's how we're depicted, and it's almost as if it has to be watered down to that element for it to be digestible, and for it to be accepted. Like, we can't evolve, like we have to be that one thing coming from like the ghetto, and then if you're educated, you work in a specific career, you have a PhD, you have a degree, like you're a unicorn, like it's abnormal. And then of course, scared me to death. When he was
It was agreement.
Right. When he was talking, when they were talking, when he was just, and he mentioned on numerous occasions how it was the reflection of the white eye, right? And how you can just kind of see that. And when, I can't remember, it was like when they were talking about the book Fuck, and it was the three white people, and she was like, I think this is the time for us to listen to the Black voice. They weren't listening to the Black voices in the room, right? And it was like, okay, majority rules. And when you have this this depiction or level of acceptance, why can't Black art be diversified? Why can't it be more than one thing? And if it's as if it's accepted by white people, then at that point it is acceptable. And I think that's where a lot of his frustration was coming from, not even necessarily directed towards the narrative, but because it is so mainstream and that's how we're viewed on a continuous basis. We want to be, I can't speak, I personally would like to say, I would like for our community to be identified outside of that. So that's just my perspective.
Yeah, I think there's some really interesting stuff dealing with the industry of publishing and its influence over, because it's not just that his books aren't selling, they won't publish his latest book because they don't think it's going to sell. And a lot of publishing companies, movie studios, etc., they make these decisions about what they're going to produce based on their perception of what audiences want, when what that means is that they're actually determining what their audiences get access to. And so they can put the blame on the readers and on the audience when they're the ones who are actually making that decision. And so the fact that, the publishers are white, the film director that he's talking to is white, the person running the awards thing is white, is a reflection of problems with the industry and how diversity is not inclusion, that you actually have to have a voice in the room and have some power in the room for that to matter. And just the way that I think people should trust audiences more and take risks instead of saying, this is what the audience wants, because then you limit what the audience wants.
And who gets to be in the audience? Who gets that access? In the book, Monk was a judge on his own. There wasn't that moment of, and I thought that was an interesting choice to have the Centaur Golden in the room too. But he was on his own and he really had no voice. And so as we think about even 2 is not enough, right? Think about diversity and inclusion and blah, blah. Well, they're in the room. They're at the table, but they don't have a collective voice. And I think that is true representation too, because okay, there might be one judge, there might be one editor, there might be one, filmmaker or producer, but how many does it take to, actually have a true and collective voice? And I think it did a good job of representing that too.
Which I don't want to let audiences off the hook. It's not all the publishers. Definitely, there is demand for certain types of stories and rejections of certain types of stories and ideas about what is real and desire for what is real that is based in stereotypes. And that's, not just affecting Black people, but people of other races and queer people and disabled people, et cetera, as well, in very, very limiting ways in terms of what stories get told.
One story is not enough. One character is not enough. I do want to connect to this idea between, judgment on literature for being represented in a particular way. So, this isn't new, even thinking about criticism of Zora Neale Hurston for having a voice that wasn't seen to be, professional. And do we really want to represent Black stories like that? Yes. And, criticism from Richard Wright, the fallout with Langston Hughes. If only certain amount of our work is going to circulate, who gets to sanction that? So that was coming from within. And I think that's relevant too, to think about what is a contemporary, take even from, 2001 with Everett thinking about Sapphire, we're, 2024 now. I was almost at 23, we're in 24. It's still this idea of like, okay, well, if something's gonna circulate, what's the story gonna be? So another question to open up and think about is, how do we get, I don't wanna say acceptance of multiple stories, but acknowledgement of multiple stories. Because it doesn't even matter, if they're accepted, but like, can we look at multiple layers? Being from the South, can we look at Southern stories? Can we look at, various regional age, class, gender? Can we look at all of the complexity in these stories? Or is it like, oh, if there's one, which one is it gonna be? We're getting toward time. Last words?
One last question, anyone?
Can you comment on the inclusion of the doll test photo? I don't remember that from the book. It might have been in there.
It wasn't in the book.
It was so
Yeah.
random, but so good.
Yeah, and so we think about the Kenneth and Mimi Clark test, look at who, which color dolls are preferred by children. And I think looking at that in the film has us think about, like, what are we picking, right? Are we still picking the, white doll because we think that that's the one that's gonna be treated the best? And as, Monk is thinking about, okay, do I let this get published? Because he tries to shut it down by changing the name, and then it's like, oh, well, they love that too, And so what kind of love and care is given to books, films, products in the same way as we think about the commercialization of dolls? I thought that was a very powerful moment there. What are we gonna choose as we look at Black art?
Any final thoughts?
I guess my thought at the.
Hello? Okay.
I guess my thought when I'm processing the whole movie is towards the end, where he spends this entire time trying to prove a point.
Mm-hmm.
And he tried everything, all this outlandish stuff, and then at the end, he was put in a position due to his family obligations that he accepted the movie deal. And it kind of reminds me of, in this world of society, we all have to make a living, even when you're faced against something that he's like morally against. He's like, I don't want to be pigeonholed into this, but people buy this. And I'm caught in this place where I have to take this movie deal so I can take care of my family. And so I just think that he knows what was right or wrong. And for us, I'm thinking like, did he do the right thing? or not? Did he? Because he did prove a point, but he's still gonna make money and go with this movie deal.
Also, did he prove a point if nobody knows what he was doing?
Right.
You weren't in that room. And we had that conversation now with Taraji P. Henson saying, you know, pay us or we're out of the academy. And then, you know, you have Samuel L. Jackson who has said, I will take every role. And that they prove different points. But, you know, to your question, having to make a living, wanting your story told. Percival Everett has 18 novels. This is one that has been made into a book.
And they're
he's
all
part of the
very,
production
very
team,
different.
right? And so there's that question, is it enough to, you know, have a story told and make some money off of it? And maybe now, you know, we go and we read more of the work. But it is taking that risk and making a decision, you know, do I break open the door in the way that I can and then hope something else follows?
How is the net changing that?
How is
The internet changing?
the internet changing that? I think more circulating because of the internet. We're looking at, you know, other media. We're looking at, you know, TikTok influencing. I mean, people are making money in different ways. It's still not trickling down in the same way. But, you know, I think more is able to circulate. We just still have to be responsible.
And I think there's probably some of the same criticism leveled at various internet personalities in terms
Who's making
of
the millions?
who's promoting stereotypes through the way they're presenting themselves, the way that they're you know, contributing to the single story. But like, what if that's their life? What if that's their story?
Can we look at multiple stories?
Yes.
I think we're done.
Yeah, let's
Yeah.
thank Dr. Stephens and Dr. Lewis.